This is Benjie Minton's story.
Good afternoon. How are you? I was born in Ahoskie, North Carolina in 1956. My father was a carpenter. My mother was a homemaker. We lived in a little house on Church Street. I had an older sister, Judy, who was 2 years older than me. I had an much older brother. He was 6 or 8 years older. His name was Chris, and Chris he had been adopted. Certainly I was a late in life child. My mother was 42 when I was born. Her first baby, before they adopted Chris, ended up living 8 minutes. He was a blue baby, and then I don't think they tried to have babies for a while. They adopted Chris, and then they had Judy, and then they had me. So my parents, by the time I was, 5 or 6 years old, my mother was 50 years old, and my father was, in his early 50s. My father wasn't home much. He traveled a good bit. Certainly one of my earliest childhood memories, I remember he had been in Virginia Beach for a very long time, working on a beach club somewhere in the Virginia Beach area, doing all of the trim carpentry up there. And so we drove up for the day to look, because Ahoskie is 60 or 70 miles southwest of the Norfolk, Virginia area. And we got to look at the inside of this beach club right on the ocean. There was a big ship's whale in the middle of the wheel, in the middle of the club, whatever it was. And on the out, then you would walk through the club, and it was right on the ocean. And I remember going out into the ocean for the first time and taking off our shoes and watching the surf wash over your feet, which was kind of a unique experience for a kid who'd never seen the ocean before. My father, I remember, my father and my mother, but my father got sick when I was very young and ended up dying when I was 6 years old in the first grade. He got bladder cancer and was in the hospital a good bit. And so he not only was he absent at work, but he was absent when he got sick, and he was hospitalized. We rented a house in Ahoskie, and I think we eventually got evicted, and we ended up moving to a little town called Union, North Carolina, which was 6 miles outside of Ahoskie, and it was where both my mother and my father were born, and that's where my grandparents lived. We rented a little house, house, kind of a ramshackle house, but it had the whole yard was full of pecan trees. We called it Pecan Palace. And my father was in the hospital. My mother was trying to work. She had never worked in her life. I mean, it was the 1950s, and at 50 years old, all of a sudden she had to go back to work and be the main breadwinner, which was hard. And a couple of boys broke into our house and ransacked our house, and got into my father's car and cut the seats up, and it was just a terrible situation. They destroyed everything we had that was worth anything, and then we left there and ended up moving in with my grandparents, who lived in a 4-room house with a wood stove and a well pump on the back porch, no running water on the inside of the house, and we had an outhouse that we had to use, and that was. That became our reality. I had a cousin, my father's brother, lived a couple of houses down, and they had indoor plumbing, and I thought they were rich. So I go, oh my gosh, that would be great if you had indoor plumbing. I just didn't remember much of the stuff going on in, when I was much younger in Ahoskie. My father, he finally passed away. My father died November the 22nd, 1962, 1 year to the day before John F. Kennedy died. And my father, in this house, was my mother, my sister, my grandfather, who was also very sick, and my grandmother, and me. I think my mother and my sister shared a bedroom. I slept on the sofa, and I have no idea where Chris slept. But that's how we were living during that time frame. My father died in November. My grandfather died in December. And my uncle, we had an Uncle Richard and an Aunt Louise, and it was my mother's older sister and her husband Richard. They were my parents' best friends, and he was a farmer, and Uncle Richard died in January. So within 3 months, my mother lost her father, her husband, and their best friend. Her older sister's husband, and tried to make the best of of a life for us. We ended up moving. She got a job. We moved back to a Hosky and rented an old house, and was going to school at a Hosky elementary school in the first and the second grade. We came home one day from school, and my mother was gone. And apparently my mother had had a nervous breakdown, and my aunts and uncles had taken her to Dorothea Dix. And Chris and Judy and I moved in with Ani, who was Richard's wife, and we stayed with them for about 4 months or so. I guess we stayed with Uncle. We had my mother's older brother, Uncle Ray. We stayed with them for a couple of weeks, and then we went to somebody else's house for a couple of weeks. They just kept moving us around, and then we ended up with we ended up with Ani, and we stayed with her for 3 or 4 months. At the end of the second grade, there's always vacation Bible school. We were Methodist, and so at the end of the second grade, we went to vacation Bible school. And on the last day of vacation Bible school, my Uncle Ray picked us up at school in his car, did not take us back to Ani's house. And he and his wife, Louise, I think she went, drove Chris, Judy, and I to Raleigh, and enrolled us into the Methodist Home for Children in Raleigh. It was the last day of vacation Bible school, and that was it. And that was my first day at the Methodist Home. I was moved into a room with 2 other guys. There was a boy named Robert Sanders who became my best friend, and a guy named Henry Burton. And I remember that night I started crying because I was homesick. It was so disorienting, for us to be taken away from everything and driven away and put in a house full of boys. And the house parents came that night, got me out of the room, took me to a bathroom at the end of the hall. I was living in the Borden Cottage, which is still standing at the Methodist Home near in what is the park called? Fletcher Park in Raleigh. And if you stand outside of the Borden Cottage, and if you look up in the upstairs bedroom, on the upstairs left bedroom, that was the first night I stayed in the Methodist Home, was in that front left bedroom. And they took me down the hallway to a bathroom right at the top of the steps, and they gave me a spoonful of peanut butter molasses and told me it was homesick medicine. So that kind of took care of it, and I got used to it, and we settled into life at the Methodist Home. And we went to Wiley Elementary School, and public school. And you would leave the home. The Methodist home was fenced. It was it was very capital. I mean, you had they controlled your movements, whatever they had to. There were 150 kids there, and of all ages, and they had 10 or 12 cottages, and so we all went and ate at a central cafeteria for dinner, and at school we had lunch, and then in the summertime we ate lunch and dinner at the cafeteria. And we had a swimming pool, and we had a baseball field, and we had a gymnasium, so it was kind of like living at summer camp, except for you just weren't home. And we didn't see my mother for a couple of years, but we would go back and visit. And I had one kind of terrible memory when everything, when they had taken our house apart and, took all of our stuff. They moved it. All of our stuff was stored in one of our relatives had a sporting goods store, and they all went upstairs. And I remember coming back, and my brother Chris was an avid model builder, and he had built a beautiful sailing ship and used fishing wire to do all the rigging and all that kind of stuff. And it was on one of my relatives' mantelpiece, and that was kind of sad, that they had confiscated our stuff. Of course, nobody else was there to get it. My mother was gone, and the Methodist home certainly didn't want it. So it was kind of a, it was tough. But the Methodist home, they cared well, and we were well cared for. We got it was a clean, safe place to live. We were fed well, we were cared for. I had, in that same cottage, our house parents at the time, when I was this was when I was in the 3rd and 4th grades. When I was in the 5th grade, I moved to another cottage, but when I was in the 3rd and 4th grade, we lived there, and my house parents were the Spates. Mr. and Mrs. Spate were our house parents. And in the downstairs back right of that house, there was a bathroom. We had a big bank of toilets and sinks and things like that, and had a shower. And one of my not so fond memories, 12 naked boys running around in the back of this bathroom, all crowding into the shower. And the Methodist home had passed a rule that said you can't say God anymore. You just can't say God, because that's kin to saying God, which is taking the Lord's name in vain. And so we were, a bunch of us in the shower at the same time, washing off and whatever. And apparently somebody bumped into me, and I must have said God. But Mrs. Spate reached into the shower and yanked me out. And what they did at the Methodist home was, those paddles that you get at the state fair that had the little red balloon, it had a little red ball on the end of the paddle with a staple, and then it had a little piece of elastic, and you would bang this piece of this thing. Well, when the elastic string broke loose, they would take the staple out of it, and they would confiscate that thing, and they would use it as a weapon. And that's what they would paddle you with, was those red balls. So Mrs. Spate, or those paddles from the thing you got at the state fair. So Mrs. Spate grabbed me and yanked me and pulled me out of the shower and whacked me twice on a wet, naked bottom. Bam, bam, she hit me twice. And I looked at her, it hurt like the crap. And I looked at her, I went, God, what'd you do that for? Bam, bam, she popped me again. So that was, but it was okay. When I was in the 4th grade, I was kind of small. I was 47 square. I was 47 inches tall, and I weighed 47 pounds. So that was what. Then I was in. I played Tiny Tim in the Christmas parade. In the Christmas Carol, and I had 2 lines. I said, God bless us everyone, twice. Just a number of memories. I remember Scott Hoke was not around very much. He was always off playing golf somewhere. I remember Tim Mazingo and I built a castle for our world history class out of concrete and gravel. I remember one of my favorite memories was we had a girl named Diana Longmuir who came and had moved to Raleigh from England, and she sat right in front of me in the 5th grade. And I would play with her hair till I made her mad, and then she would turn around and say, "Stop it, Benjie," and it just tickled the crap out of me. For her to say that to me in with an English accent and stuff. So, but I had it was a neat thing. I wrote a song. I was asked to sing this song. I can't remember but it was called "The Itch." I wrote a song, and it was, everybody's doing the itch, scratch it, scratch it, scratch it. Everybody's doing there were all kinds of dance songs in the mid '60s. So, and so that was one of the things that I sang that, I think, at the talent show at school. when I was in the fourth grade, I actually, I kind of ran the Methodist home or whatever, but because I was the cutest thing there, obviously, but just kidding. But when I was in the fourth grade, I won the talent show. I dressed up completely in green khakis and had a little beret on, and I sang the Ballad of the Green Beret a cappella, and there were a bunch of teenage boys that had a band, and of course they were playing a Beatles song or something. But I won the talent show. I won the first place because, who wouldn't vote for a 47-pound guy singing "Fighting Soldiers from the Sky"? So that was one of my memories at the Methodist home. The Methodist home was fine. I wanted, to get back a little bit, and I'll kind of bring this around. But my mother got out of Dorothea Dix and moved to a little town called Enfield, and moved in with a maiden aunt, and that she, and lived with for a while. Now my mother's mid-50s, late 50s, whatever, and she ended up meeting a man in Enfield named Leonard Matthews. Leonard was 65 at the time. We were in the fourth or fifth, I bet it was in the fifth grade or something. But he was 65 years old, and they ended up getting married. He courted her, and they ended up getting married. Well, he had grandchildren older than my sister and I and my brother. Oh, I'll mention my brother too. My brother didn't last very long at the Methodist home, but they, for whatever reason, my stepfather never had any interest in starting a family over again. So through whatever processes, we ended up staying at the Methodist home, even though my stepfather and mother had a house in Enfield. We would, at the Methodist home, we would go home, or to whatever, if you didn't have a family. There weren't very many orphans at the Methodist home. There were a number of people that had, family to go to, either a sickly parent or something. But we would go home 1 week in a month, and then we would go home during the Christmas break, and during the summer we would go 2 weeks and stay with our Pamela. But my mother and my stepfather would pick my sister up. We'd get on the bus, go to Rocky Mount. They would pick us up at 8 o'clock at night in Rocky Mount. We'd go stay with them, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday afternoon, my mother and my stepfather would put us in the car, take us back to Rocky Mount, and put us back on the bus station, and we wouldn't see them for another month. It was, kind of strange, but that was our reality. My brother didn't last very long at the Methodist home. He was 14 or 15. He had literally been our parent when we were in the second grade, when my mother was trying to work, and he was taking care of Judy and I. He might have been 16, got a job at a gas station, was paying a lot of the bills. And when they took us to the home, they separated us because the Methodist home had they had boys' cottages and girls' cottages on one side of the campus and boys' cottages on the other side of the campus. And then the cottages individually were segregated by age. So we, you would move, and then when you aged out in one cottage, you would move over to the next cottage. And so I stayed at Borden for the third and the fourth grade, and then I stayed at a cottage called Massey in the fifth and sixth grade. Massey was a newer cottage. It's been torn down if you're driving up to go to Fletcher Park. As you're going up that big hill in Raleigh, the Massey cottage was kind of up on the hill on the left, and it was a one-story cottage, and there were 12 boys. They had 4 double rooms and 4 single rooms. One of the single rooms had its own bath, which is kind of an interesting. So I guess the older boys, when I was in the fifth grade, I stayed in the double, the rooms, and had a roommate. But when I was in the sixth grade, I moved, and I was able to get one of the private rooms, but it came with responsibility. You had to wash everybody's clothes. it was right across the street from the laundry, so you had to do all the. Now they actually had a big laundry where they did sheets and the main clothes and stuff, but I had to wash everybody in all their T-shirts and socks and underwear and fold it up and put it in their room. But that was the responsibility you had to do to be able to get one of the private rooms. So I did that for a while. But once again, that was our reality, and I kind of moved through the system. When I was in the 7th grade, they had gotten a new superintendent at the Methodist home, a guy named Bill Britton, and he was trying to shake things up. He was a much more modern guy. He didn't grow up, in that same old corporate, orphanage structure, whatever. He had taken over as the superintendent. And he did something kind of unique. There was an older cottage, and it's the only other cottage that's still standing at the Methodist home. It was called Garris. And Garris was the cottage for senior high school boys, if you were in the 10th, 11th, and 12th grade. That was a cottage, and he kind of reached down into the system, and he grabbed me and a guy named Larry Paul, who was in our school, or was in our class, and Larry was a great athlete, and Mr. Britton, Mr. Britton was very athletic, and he, really took a liking to Larry and stuff, and he reached down and he plucked Larry and I, and he moved us I moved from Massey in the 6th grade to the 7th grade. They put me in Garris Cottage with all the senior boys. There were, the two of us roomed together in Garris Cottage with a whole completely different age set. He was shaking it up, and inevitably he started putting families together and doing some other things. He became, much more progressive in that regard. But that was kind of a unique circumstance for him to reach down there and stick the two of us in Garris Cottage and with all of the older boys. And, you just had to cope and deal with it, with all of them. Of course, no one was ever particularly, certainly didn't get picked on or anything like that. But, of course, Larry Paul would have kicked their ass. But when Larry was in the 7th grade, he was, when Larry was in the 4th grade, no, actually, let me say this. When Larry went to college, he got recruited as a linebacker at ECU when he was 5'10", 210 pounds. When Larry was in the 4th grade, he was 5'10", 210 pounds. So he was a big boy. So, Larry kind of became my protector, and Larry and I were very close. He was just a great guy. Something else that was kind of interesting, I went through the 7th grade, and I ran cross country and track that year. I went out for the cross country or the track team and was going to be a miler. Of course, still, weighed 70 pounds or something like that in the 7th or 8th grade. But I went out for the track team. And the Methodist home, this is at Daniels Junior High School, and at the Methodist home, they bussed us over. You go over and you show up at get on the bus, you go over there, and then the bus was always waiting at Daniels Junior High School for all the Methodist home kids to get on the bus and go home. Well, during the school year, you always had chores. When you got back to the Methodist home, you were either assigned to the mess hall, or you were assigned to a lot of the girls worked in the laundry and just different jobs around campus. Most of the young men were assigned to maintenance. You go, 63 acres of oak trees. There was a lot of leaves to rake and that kind of thing. And so when you got home, you dropped your books off at your cottage. You ran over to the maintenance shop, and you went to work. One of our classmates, a guy named Larry Buffalo, Larry was always the fastest guy in getting his books off and getting to the maintenance shop, because that allowed him to be the first one in line to get on the riding lawnmower or the tractor, and all the rest of us had to rake leaves. But when you didn't get back on the bus, at Daniels Junior High School, there was no controlling legal authority from that point on. They didn't know where you were. You went to track practice, you took a shower, and then we walked home. And we got home when we got home, and so it was a bit of a revelation from a freedom perspective. Larry and I walked home every afternoon by ourselves or with other, if somebody else was on the track team or whatever, and we would just walk back home then so when I was a junior, when I was in the 8th grade, I was the football manager. Meant I didn't get back on the bus. I was the basketball manager, which means I didn't get back on the bus. And I ran track, was a miler, which meant I didn't get back on the bus. And so we had freedom, that era too. A lot of the high school kids, or a lot of the middle school Daniels kids would always stop at Johnson's Pharmacy and get a soda or something and hang out. Well, Larry and I did that. We would stop by there and then we would walk home, and nobody was the wiser for where we were, what we were doing. We just, we had our own little set of freedom. It was kind of a revelation. And we made a lot of friends at school, and I feel blessed, even though I didn't grow up in my hometown and get the chance to go to my own schools. I loved Daniels High School, junior high school, and I love Broughton High School. Just a lot of nice people, and we just met, a whole bunch of great people, and we made good friends, and that was just a kind of an experience that I learned. And if you be a good friend, if you can make friends if you are a friend. And so it was a fabulous experience for me. And even though I was living in an institution, I never felt different. And I'm sure there were some kids that just had a hard time adjusting to the environment, but I never did. And I don't know what gave me that resiliency, but it was just kind of a thing, and I made friends easily. It was kind of difficult. I never particularly had a great relationship with my sister. We were separated, and she and I were so different. She, I think she kind of resented the fact that I made friends, and it was kind of a tough thing. I think there was other people at the home too that kind of, we just were able to make friends at school because we were hanging out with them. That's what was critical, and that was tough for the kids at the home to do that because you couldn't do that really at school, and you couldn't do it afterwards because they came home and they were fenced in, and that was kind of a unique situation for the athletes or people that were, if you were involved in something, you certainly had the freedom to be able to expand your relationships. So that was kind of a kind of a different thing from it. I'm trying to think of other things. Was in chorus. I remember Debbie Stanton and I sang a cappella Moon River together. We sang Moon River at a concert. Moon River. That was long before my voice changed. So I think she sang below me. But that was those days. So that was kind of my experience growing up at the Methodist home. It was kind of a unique experience. My like I said, we would go home. I made friends with my. Go ahead.